Right. Okay, we're good.
Welcome everyone to our November LPC meeting. Special welcome back to any of you that were in Tampa last week for the National League of Cities. Exciting that we will be hosting the National League of Cities conference next year in 2025. We have a very important first order of business, and that is always the review and adoption of our minutes. Hopefully you've all had time to thoroughly review the minutes that were emailed out in advance. And somebody is excited to make a motion on those minutes of October 21st. Oh, I picked my colleague Richard Higginson from Bountiful to make the motion, and I see Dan Dugan from Salt Lake, super excited to second that motion. Thank you. So we have a motion to approve the minutes. Any discussion? Seeing no one excited to discuss, I'll place it. All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Thank you for helping us do our most important agenda item. And I do want to welcome back, by the way, those of you that read your Friday facts will know that Liam Drellkill has moved on from the league staff, but not moved very far. And Liam, wave, he's in the back. Liam moved just as far as working with me in my day job, which means you'll still get to see him at these meetings. So feel free to give him all the congratulations for having to spend more time with me. Justin, am I turning it over to Carson? Is he first up on our research and data discussion?
Yep.
Okay, I saw Carson's like running with his laptop, so hopefully he's all ready.
Hopefully.
All right, turning it over to you.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to have to refresh this really quick. All right, so we've got a lot to cover today. I'll just kick things off with our data and research plan. In the past couple of years, we've done a fall land use survey that's been fairly intensive and technical. What the feedback we've heard in the past is because that survey has dealt with multiple departments, might be your planning department, managers, a whole slew of people, rather than try to just send out one big survey that somebody has to get feedback from a bunch of different departments on. We're going to try to break it up a little bit more this year. So the first section they'll be sending this week, probably tomorrow, will be on parking. We've had a lot of parking policy discussions, so we're going to try to get a little bit more data from you on what your parking requirements are, what your stall sizes are, just to get a little bit more nuance as we continue that policy discussion. So you can look for that this week, and then we'll be asking follow-up surveys on infrastructure and housing in the coming weeks. We will distribute this through our policy or our LPC list through Friday Facts. We'll do some targeted outreach as needed, and we'll try to work with the city managers to make sure that every city has the opportunity to fill these out. So I know everybody's favorite thing is filling out league surveys, but thank you in advance because these have been really critical in the past in both our legislative advocacy and trying to find policy that works for all of our members. Oh, and then the second ask I will make is we want to make one more pitch for the alcohol proximity issue, alcohol proximity licensing. We've asked this a couple times this year, and we'll just make one more ask. And I know many of you already sent this out. What we're looking for specifically is just examples where the buffer requirements around establishments that serve alcohol, the buffer requirements between those and community locations like parks or churches or schools, where that has caused an issue for redevelopment in your community. So again, we've already received a couple examples. We just want to make one more ask if there's anything burning on your mind. We're engaged in pretty active conversations on that issue, and that's one where examples really help. So that's all of our data asks. We'll be doing Slido throughout this meeting. So get your phones ready. Justin will cue you off, and then we'll just, I think we'll make it up to 8 questions that are kind of scattered throughout the meeting. So I'll just ask, once you get started on Slido, just leave it on your phone so you can fill it out more easily. And with that, I will turn it back to Justin.
All right, thanks, Carson. All right, a few things. So, election recap. There are new legislators. I'm sure all of you are aware of the new legislators that are in your area, that cover your city. But if you're not, if you can scan that QR code, we have legislator contact information. And Cassidy did a great job tracking down contact she can for new legislators. So we tell you this all the time, reach out to your legislators, talk to them. Particularly for brand new legislators, this is a great time to reach out to them and talk to them. You let them know what your city does, what service infrastructure your city actually provides, and then just ask them to engage with us on different issues. So again, please reach out to your new legislators. And in some cases, we've got legislators who were representatives, who are now senators. There's a handful of those. So reach out. Cassidy, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, don't get overwhelmed by the table when it opens up. You can search for your city name underneath the search bar and then it'll pull up just your legislators. So don't click through every page of the table. Use the search function. It'll help you out.
There you go. With that, just some updates on changes in leadership. So again, we told you, reach out to your legislators. If you have legislators who are now in leadership or have changed, this is also a good time to reach out there. So in the Senate, President Adams is still President Adams. That has remained the same. But the rest of these names are new as far as the Senate majority leadership goes. So Senator Kurt Colomore is now the majority leader. Senator Chris Wilson is the majority whip, and Senator Mike McKell is the majority assistant whip. So if you have relationships with them, good to reach out there as well. Minority leadership in the Senate, the minority leader, Senator Luz Escamilla, minority whip, Senator Karen Kwan, minority assistant whip, Senator Jen Plum, and the minority caucus manager and Senator Kathleen Reeby. So again, great chance to reach out to them, but I want to make sure everyone knows that. In the House, the majority leadership remain the same, no real changes there. And minority leadership is getting elected tomorrow night over in the House. So we don't have that one up yet because there is no election that's happened yet there. So tomorrow night, though, we'll find out what the minority leadership looks like. So a few things are coming out. This week is the final interim of the interim session. So we've got Wednesday, several things that are up in committee. We ran through the agendas this morning. Not all of the agendas are up yet. It'd be awesome if they were, but they're not. We'll see those tomorrow. And for some of the agendas where we have agenda items, we don't have draft bill language on the committee's site yet. So there may be things we reach out to you very quickly about in the next couple of days. Depend feedback on things. But many of the things that we have seen on the agenda are things that we've talked about here in previous LPCs, so we have a pretty good idea where those are going. But watch for things to come out this week and watch for Friday Facts because there will likely be plenty to update there. But one of the things that we have been waiting for is the gravel pit study. We thought we might see that last week. It did not come out last week. So we're still waiting on that. It's coming soon, hopefully very soon. And we'll have an idea where that is going. But we thought we might have that to report on today, but we don't have that one yet. We have a work group. Thank you to all of those who have been meeting here and have been involved in those. But really at this point, we're waiting for the study to inform what happens next. Representative Casey Snyder has said there will be some kind of bill around gravel this year. Some of that will get informed by the study, but really waiting to see where that goes. So no updates on that one is the big update as far as gravel pits goes. As soon as that study does hit for those involved in kind of the gravel pit working group, we do expect to get together and talk about that. So wait for that one. A water update. So not necessarily this session, but maybe, you never know. But we do expect phasing out of non-functional turf to be a topic in the next year. We know this is something that the governor's transition team has been looking at for the second term. So the way it stands now, there was a bill last year that said for government facilities, you can't have non-functional turf. There's certain percentages around that. This year, there's discussion around that for commercial properties. And we see the trend where this is going. So this is your chance to warm up for Slido because we're going to ask you a couple of questions about non-functional turf. So get out your phones. This is your chance to join Slido now. You can scan the QR code or just go to slido.com and put in the number 1615873. Operators are standing by. All right, so again, we do not have a specific bill. We do not have a specific proposal on this one, but asking a general question. So our first question here, how comfortable would you be with a proposal to phase out non-functional turf in all new development? Now, some of you are going to say, what is non-functional turf? And there's no perfect definition on that one. But maybe the easy, not scientific one is the only time anyone ever walks on that turf is when you mow it. Is maybe a shorthand way for non-functional turf. The only time anyone really ever uses that turf is when the guys go out and mow it. So how comfortable would you be with a proposal to phase out non-functional turf in all new development? And when we say all new development, commercial, single family, we're not making a distinction here, just any new development. So give you a second here to answer on that one. And again, we don't have a bill, we're not taking a specific position, but we know this is going to come up within the next year-ish. Okay. All right, and we're going to jump to our next question. So this is a separate question, although it looks awfully similar. How comfortable would you be with a phased proposal to replace non-functional turf with water-wise landscaping in existing development? So this is saying for all those places that have grass now that is non-functional turf, what is your comfort level with phasing that out in a certain time period? Again, we don't have a specific proposal, but looking at phasing out, flipping the script for a lot of current non-functional turf. All right, we've broken 100 on that one already, so we're gonna jump over. With that, we're gonna jump over. Do you want to turn it over to Cam to talk about state housing plan? And I'm gonna hide this floating panel to give us more room. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you, Justin, and happy November, everybody. I've invited Carson to come up as well because last week was a big week, yet an incomplete week on the housing and land use front. So there's a lot we're going to try to present to you here. We've got some slider questions to get feedback from you as well. You've seen this graphic before. These are all the different planning efforts that are happening right now, all of which have a component to land use planning and the role of local government. The governor's transition team is the blue one. We've been involved in that effort. They've been meeting 1 or 2 times a week over the last few months. When Justin was just talking about water, part of the reason he was asking that question is because that's going to be a core pillar in the governor's transition team and priorities for the next 4 years. That document will go public the first week in January as part of the inauguration. You have the state housing plan, which Carson will talk about here in a moment. We've been involved in weekly meetings there. In fact, do you want to just give just a quick reminder of who's overseeing that and our role therein?
Yeah, so the state housing plan was spawned by the legislative audit 2 years ago, last year, whenever that was, feels like a long time. The legislative audit that recommended more of a strategic approach at the statewide level to be able to address housing needs and deficiencies. And the statewide housing plan is being headed up by the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. And I think it's really focused on first figuring out where we're trying to get to and how we can actually measure progress in that sense. For those of you who've been involved in the housing space for the last couple of years, it does like we're driving in a car. We're just driving in circles because we did this first. So effort from the state, the different resources, trying to make sure that we all could be on the same page about what we're doing for housing helps local governments as well, because it's more consistency, and it gives us a little bit more direction on what even the definition of moderate income housing, because we've seen that change so much. So it's a really broad effort, and I think it's too soon to say what the outcomes will be, but there's a lot of work going on in that space. There's, I think, 30 something stakeholders representing a variety of groups in the different advisory groups. And yeah, I again think it's too early to say what's going to come, but definitely a lot happening there, and we'll have a lot of impact in the coming session.
Thank you, Carson. So 2 weeks ago, the League Board of Directors met and we shared with the League Board the draft principles that are before the state housing plan. The one that's most important in my mind is the leading principle is collaboration rather than preemption or state mandates. And so that's a very good start. There are a bunch of other principles therein, and the intent that Steve Waldrop has told us, he wants to have a framework in place in January, but it will be a multi-year effort to implement the state housing plan. Envision Utah and the infrastructure and housing capacity. We talked about this briefly at the last meeting. Norm from Santa Quinn, which, by the way, happy birthday, Norm. You're welcome. And Lance from Santa Clara, Laura Briefer from Salt representing the league along with league staff in that Envision Utah effort. On the state housing plan, I should note that former league president Marcia Bastrini is on the state housing plan steering committee in addition to league staff involvement. And then, so last week, the Affordability had their last formal meeting of the year. So we're going to show you what they recommended last week, and then it's the next day to the Unified Economic Office. And Mayor Ramsey represents the league on that UEOC. And then this red dot is basically everything else. We'll touch on some of those. But we wanted to mention that at the UEOC last week, they laid out their preliminary game plan 2034. So think about this as like the 10-year plan. And Carson, I was out of town for it, but do you want to just do a quick overview of the 10, or maybe I guess Justin, you were the one who was participating. But just an overview of where it's at in the process and what's coming next.
Sorry, I'm eating while I did that. I didn't think I was running up. Swallowed. We're good now. All right. You're welcome. So 2034. So yeah, they presented this last week. And this really is an overarching plan where they're looking at what are things to do with housing, what are things to do with water, what are things to do with the economy. And I'm making a lot of, I would say, like I said, broad-based, but not particularly specific goals yet. They presented it, it's in draft form right now. We will see something more specific in January. And we do have our LPC in January before the UEOC meet. So in January, we'll come back, we'll have more specifics that we can tell you on what's in this. But again, it doesn't have particularly specific proposals, just sort of overarching kind of ideas where they'd like to go with housing, water, the economy, various things like that. So stay tuned for that one. We'll share it as we get more details, but there's not a specific plan. Like we said, the governor's got his, we'd like 35,000 starter homes in the next 5 years. We don't see anything that specific in this plan yet.
Perfect. So again, just coming back to overall timing, the governor's putting together his plan for the next 4 years. Focusing on several things for this session. Housing plan, you want a framework in January, but it's going to be a multi-year effort. The Envision Utah piece will not be done for the session. The timing there is that they want this infrastructure study done by early summer next year to anticipate the following session. The Vision 2034, which we just showed, is really the 10-year plan coming through the governor's office, focused on the Olympics as the pinnacle moment, but with all those other pieces. And then you've got CHA and Land Use Task Force this year. So when we said there are lots of moving pieces, there are indeed lots of moving pieces. Oh, well, you reset it because we didn't reset it so that we have the questions in different order. Okay, as Carson resets that, the next slides are going to be what was before the Commission on Housing Affordability. And I should note, no language was presented to the Commission on Housing Affordability, just these slides. So we know the topics that are under consideration behind the slides, but there was no bill language that was presented to the CHA. We do have some potential bill language that we received over the weekend, and it's still protected. But because we're having LPC today, we got permission this morning to share the concepts, and we'll be slidoing those concepts here in a moment. Now, I mentioned the league board met 2 weeks ago, and so we wanted to report back to you the direction the league board gave us, which we have then relayed to the co-chairs of the Commission on Housing Affordability. And a lot of that direction came because of your survey results. So for example, this is from LPC last month. This was the question we asked you around condos, and this is part of the board packet that the board considered 2 weeks ago. And this was the question about whether a city would be willing to enact an ordinance that provides incentives for affordable owner-occupied condos instead of apartments in multifamily zones where appropriate. And you can see the breakdown here. From you last month, 65% were in the definitely yes or probably yes space, 24% uncertain. These were the staff recommendations that we brought back to the board. They range from infrastructure. How do we continue partnering on ways to fund and finance infrastructure? Technical assistance, particularly for growing communities. The condos piece, which we just showed you that data. Short-term rentals. There still is not any new language out and about. There's discussion about the not well language. There are some legislators interested in that, and there are some other ideas floating around. We have a meeting later this week with some stakeholders to, I think, really start in earnest the conversation for the 2025 session around short-term rentals. And then in the legacy city piece, there's very little appetite at the Capitol to expand the first-time homebuyer program to existing units. So we still had that as a recommendation, but there's very little appetite at the Capitol to do so. There is appetite at the Capitol, though, to potentially do a revolving loan fund that would piggyback on what Ogden City has been doing, where Ogden City has been purchasing old rental units, renovating them, and then selling them off to new home buyers in the city. So there's a lot of interest of the state in that Ogden program and figuring out if there's a way to take it to scale in legacy neighborhoods. So thank you to Ogden City for leading out on the concept. The question, of course, is going to be one of dollars. Justin mentioned there's new leadership, but there's not new money. We've already been told that it's going to be an underwear and socks type Christmas this upcoming legislative session, which is different from a couple of years ago when they had significant amount of financial resources. Okay. We also recommended to the board on surplus land, publicly owned surplus land, and requiring public entities to do an inventory of your publicly owned land and then building out a plan for that land, that if it's not being used for parks or infrastructure or other reasons, it could potentially be used for housing units. And then you can see that we got good feedback from the board about what those parameters needed to look like. Meg wrote them a memo that's referenced here. We really did just pull this from the board packets. You don't have the memo, but trust me, it's a good memo. And we're working on those parameters with Steve Waldrop. Governor Cox has actually outlined that policy as his top priority as of now for the upcoming session, and he's tasked every state agency with looking at their own publicly owned land. And then this piece sets up what we received from the CHA. This was the question we asked you in two different settings, the annual convention 2 months ago now, and then at LPC just last month, where we were asking if your city would be willing to adopt an overlay to builders, essentially density bonuses, in exchange for guaranteed affordable owner-occupied housing. And you can see percentage-wise, 58% at the annual convention, 60% from LPC last month. So based on this feedback, we brought a staff recommendation to the board. The board adopted number one. They did not adopt number two. So you need not look at number two on the screen, but they just looked at number one. And then we also talked about parking. This was also the question we asked you last month, of saying cities cannot require covered parking for 1 or 2 family dwellings that are owner occupied and affordable. And 67% of you told us that that was an acceptable trade-off. So again, we took that back to the board 2 weeks ago. And so we've been proceeding based on that board direction over the last couple of weeks. So that gives you a quick snapshot of what we took to the CHA co-chairs, and Carson and Jared Tingey, our legal director, presented to the CHA because Justin and I were out of town. And so, Carson, I'll turn it to you to give a quick overview of what Senator Fillmore and Representative White, as the co-chairs, recommended to the commission for endorsement.
Thanks, Cam. And you'll see a lot on these slides. I'll just say that anybody who watched the Commission on Housing Affordability, it was kind of a whirlwind. We just threw a lot of topics up on the chairs just threw a lot of topics up on the slides, and Jared and I quickly walked through them and tried to summarize several hours worth of content into a few minutes. So there's a lot on here. And I will say that the this year may be, well, functionally, this is how it's worked the last couple of years. This year, they're proceeding a little bit more formally. But the Commission on Housing Affordability co-chairs will be taking all of these topics that were recommended. So nothing set in stone, but they'll be taking all of these topics that are recommended and sitting down with some of their colleagues and trying to figure out what they actually want to start with this year. So you'll see a range of things, and I'll just move through. There's a couple slides. You'll see quite a wide list of things here. Some of these are technical land use task force items. Some of these are major housing policies like overlay. Some of these are very concerning to us, like BNC. Some of these will potentially help us, like faster OPRO opinion timings. So everything's on the table, I'd say, right now, and we'll be working with the co-chairs, and we'll keep you apprised of what they actually decide to do. We expect that there will be a bill in the Political Subdivisions Interim Committee that's responding to the legislative audit. This was a bill file that they opened 2 meetings ago, and they've discussed a little bit. We expect that there will be a bill that contains some pieces of this at Wednesday's interim meeting, but we're not exactly certain what will make that final cut. And then whatever is not in there, there'll be I believe 4 total bills in the housing and land use space just from the Commission on Housing Affordability, not including the political subs bill. So there'll be a lot of different moving pieces, and trying to figure out where everything's going and which things to oppose, which things to support will take a lot of concerted work from this group. So yeah, that unfortunately, the best update I have for you on the commission is just hold tight. We should know more in the coming weeks on what things are actually on the table and up for discussion, which pieces are kind of going by the wayside, but expect a fast and furious amount of work once we actually get to that point.
So that being said, we want to give this body a chance to ask any questions about anything that you've seen on the screen here before we jump into some Slido questions that will get to the draft bill we're anticipating to come out this week. So again, these are the actual slides from the commission. So we didn't organize them this way. Mayor Burton, let's start with you. And then, oh, Lynn, you're here in person. You were just on a screen with me like 15 minutes ago. Okay, Mayor Burton.
I don't know if you heard, but West Jordan Council has agreed they're going to meet to discuss removing garages from code requirement in the city. That'll be a citywide application. So they haven't done that yet. They've put that on the agenda to make that happen.
Cool. Thank you for the update. Let's go to Lynn, and then I'm Cassidy. Since I pulled Carson up here, I was just saying if there are any questions online. Perfect. How many are online? How many people are online? 113. 113. Okay, so 113 online plus people in the room. So thank you everybody for joining us. Lynn.
Yes, 2 questions. On the screen here, they have the first one listed as real property transfer to government entities. I'm not sure what that refers to. And then second, while you're thinking about that, I would be interested to know more how they envision utilizing the inventory of public property for housing. Are they suggesting that the public entities will build housing? Are they suggesting they will sell that or give that property at a discount? I'd just be interested to see how they anticipate that inventory being used for housing, or what's the mechanism to get from A to B?
Yeah, I'll take the first question and then hand off the much harder question to Cam. So this is one of those technical issues that is a land use task force item that has made it onto the Commission on Housing Affordability list. So what we're specifically trying to address, and this was brought to us by Salt Lake City 2, maybe 3 years ago, and we're just kind of working through it. This is the issue where some cities have found out that individuals are just quick deeding property over to local governments, and maybe it's because it's hazardous, maybe it's because there's some problem with the property, but basically they're just passing it off to local governments, and the local governments are not made aware of it. So we're trying to address that issue through the land use task force, and that's now in the job mix.
Lynn, I'm glad you asked the question because I referenced that this was a priority, and let me explain where we're at as of November 18th at 12:49 p.m. Okay. I'll start first on the state side. So Governor Cox has asked all the state agencies to do an inventory of all of their state-owned land and then identify which land does not have any sort of current or future purpose attached to it. So in other words, surplus. So that's state-owned land that could be owned by a university, it could be owned by UDOT, it could be owned by fill in the blank. This would also apply to entities like Sitla that are also, state-owned land but have a different purpose. So the intent, once they've done that inventory and they've been tasked to do that inventory by the end of the calendar year, is then to determine how many of those acres would fit that surplus definition. And then there are a couple of paths that they could go down, they being the state. Path number one could be that the state just disposes of that land. And there's already a process in state law right now for disposing of that land. And because of Farmington City a few years ago, when Dave Milheim was still the city manager there, we actually tweaked that process to require notification to the city for disposing of that surplus land. So there's been language going back and forth that would allow the state to dispose of that land potentially for less than fair market value if it was going to be utilized for affordable housing. So in other words, it's state-owned land. That land could be sold at a lower price than privately owned land that's going back and forth. So if that land is being sold at a lower price, then the benefit of that land being cheaper needs to go to the future home buyer and not just get caught up in the development process. Okay. So that's one option, is you dispose of it and sell it. A second option would be that surplus state land could go into a state community land trust. And then someone at the state would have to manage that community land trust. But the idea there is the state would still retain the ownership through the land trust, but then you would be leasing out the buildings on top of the land, also with the intent of building affordable housing, particularly condos in that situation, which is why trying to solve the barriers to condo piece that we were talking about a moment ago. Now, keep in mind, state land is not subject to local zoning currently. So if you have state-owned property in Carson City, or if Carson City, better put, has state-owned property within the city, it's not subject to that zoning anyway. Now, if the state sold the land to Cameron, well, now it's private property, I'm subject to zoning. And so there's this question of what does that sequencing look like? And all these questions are still up in the air. Now, what that means on the local side, since I referenced it on the state side, on the local side, they want to do that same sort of inventory. And then you could see a potentially similar process at the local level where the city could dispose of it, but could have that provision where you could dispose of it for lower than fair market value so long as it's going to be developed into affordable home ownership, or it could potentially go into some sort of community land trust. The other unanswered question, and then I'll come to your follow-up question, Lynn, and that's I'll hand it back there too, is I mentioned that the state-owned land in Carson City is not subject to state zoning, but it's an unanswered question about what happens with the infrastructure hookups. And so if you have publicly owned land that right now is sitting vacant, and then the state says, we're going to put this into community land trust and develop housing units, then is Carson City obligated to provide the infrastructure, or does Carson City still have the flexibility to say, actually, we can't accommodate more housing units here because of infrastructure. So therefore, even though it's not subject to zoning, we aren't hooking it up. And that was one of the big questions that came up at the board meeting and is still up in the air. Okay, there's the quick overview. Let's go, Lynn, and then it was Mark in the back.
Thank you, Cameron. Just a quick follow-up question. If at the end of the day, the statute is amended to say for surplus government-owned land, you may sell it for less than fair market value for affordable housing. That's authorization only.
Mm-hmm.
If on the other hand, they say you shall, then that's a government imposed subsidy for affordable. Do you have any idea what direction that is headed?
That was also part of the discussion at the board level, is how much of this was enabling versus requiring. And the instructions the board gave us was focus on the enabling piece, but there has been no language drafted outside of enabling language for the lower than fair market value. That's the only piece we've seen thus far. Mark?
So could we just make sure and add a provision that says that the state will honor its existing development agreements with cities? One of the things that I'm concerned about with this inventory is, we have, I want to see 60 acres with University of Utah Medical Center in our downtown core. The last thing I want is for some aspiring land grab to say, hey, let's just do this. there's a development agreement in place. There's an entitlement that took place with that. And fundamentally, they need to stay current with the agreements that are in place. I don't want to just see things get blanket thrown away. And I would never suspect our state of violating our trust by doing something like that, but I would just like to put that in ink.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Thank you, Mark. Okay. We do have some Slido questions to get to in this space on specific items, but we wanted to make sure you'd all at least had a chance to see what was before the CHA and what came out of last week's meetings. Are there any other questions of any of the items up here that Carson or I could answer before we move? Oh, yeah. Hold on.
One moment,
the
wait
mic,
for the
just
mic so that folks online can hear you.
I just want to make sure we're giving these things away. Is there something that's going to be enabling to say this is 100% deed restricted to owner occupancy?
You're talking about public lands for housing, Pete?
Yes.
That's part of the discussion is if the state is going to put up land that the state owns, getting a guaranteed outcome with it. Now, what that percentage is still up in the air, but that's been the intent. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Cassidy, nobody online? Okay. Okay, so we mentioned that we got some language over the weekend that gets to the state overlay concept, but also gets to the data reporting side and kind of the regional concept that we actually brought up 2 LPCs ago that has been kind of part of the discussion. Thus far, what we've seen in the overlay space has been the enabling language that we've surveyed about. We've surveyed you in the past of enabling a Carson City. Cameron City is always a bad city, so I'll use Carson City as a good city. Carson City to provide a density bonus in exchange for affordable home ownership. So having enabling language there that then the city could apply within the city and a builder could apply for. Additional reporting metrics that get to really the centerpiece of this whole conversation for the last few years, which is which data sets are we using and how do we get better data? Do you want to just talk about that a little bit about kind of this piece, or do you want to wait until after?
Let's wait till after.
Wait, okay. And then the third piece, we asked you a Slido question a couple of meetings ago about what a regional approach to housing could look like. There's been a lot of interest at the Capitol about how Utah really does lead the country in cooperation when it comes to planning for transportation with the Unified Plan on Transportation. And the question that gets asked regularly has been, how could we take that type of coordination and apply it to housing, recognizing that on the housing side, you're dealing with private property rather than public infrastructure, and you're dealing with a kind of much more complicated scale than you are with planning for roads and transit and other transportation corridors. So right now, I know the framework is let's figure out what success looks like, what the metrics are. Still unclear on how many regions you have, how many sub-regions there might be, and then how it all fits in state housing plan. But you know, we see them dipping their toe in this regional effort. Okay, so with that being said, here's your first Slido question of the day, and it's just open-ended. We just gave you that quick and dirty overview, but we want your feedback on that concept of the density bonus in exchange for affordable home ownership that the city would impose rather than the state saying it's an upzone anytime, anywhere, any place. And then that regional planning and the regional coordination, how, what alarms you about that? What intrigues you about that? Open-ended question here. We want as much feedback on it as possible. Again, we were authorized to share those draft concepts with you today, and we anticipate a lot of discussion starting on Wednesday at the Capitol on these concepts. Anything you want to add here before you have the next slide of questions? So, okay. Cast anything online? Okay, I just don't want our online folks to think we forgot them.
We have 1 or 2 comments. Do you want to hear them?
Sure, while people are typing in.
Okay. Marcus Alton said, Governor Cox and Representative White presented at ULUI conference a few weeks/months ago. They talked about the state fighting to get more federal lands turned over and how it could open up property for development. Is the state going to start building affordable housing? Are they selling the land? Hate to see us fight so hard to get control only to turn it over to private development.
Yeah. Excellent question. The 30-second answer is this. There are There have been bills in Congress recently that haven't gone anywhere that would transfer lands that are currently owned by the federal government, that are not environmentally sensitive or otherwise. The federal government would transfer those lands for private development for affordable housing. Those bills have not gone anywhere in the last couple of Congresses. It won't happen during the lame duck session. Who knows what'll happen in January, because you've obviously got a massive changing of the guard that'll be happening over the next few weeks. I think there is a feeling among some at the State House that they don't want the perception to be we're fighting for local control of these lands on behalf of development. I think there are two different issues. Issue number one is, how do we get more local control of federally owned land? Question number two is, in the places where it's appropriate, where could some of these federally controlled parcels be used for housing? So the state is actually putting together a map. We've asked for it, and they're hope to have it for us in the next few weeks, of all the federally owned parcels in or adjacent to cities. Because that would be really informative for your community to say, okay, this is in adjacent cities. Are any of these parcels places where it may make sense to do housing? And that's a separate conversation from the overall effort of having more local control over certain types of public land, particularly land that's not designated for national parks or other categories. Anything else?
We also have another comment from Dennis Marker. State may not be subject to zoning, but they are subject to impact fees. We ran into an issue where the state permitted development on their property, but didn't bring water to support it.
Well, there's an ombudsman decision from maybe 3 weeks ago now, right, Owen, that dealt with public entities. In this case, it was school districts, and whether or not they should have to pay impact fees. So that, Dennis, I'm glad you brought that up, because that'll be one of the interesting questions about that nexus of the local government providing infrastructure to these properties, and then what's the sequence of when they're developed for housing. But I've had a couple of cities who've reached out to us since we've started talking about this concept, and they said, actually, we found a few parcels in our city that we didn't even know we owned. And that's a couple acres here, a couple acres there. The city has no plans for them. They're in neighborhoods. And the city said, sure, like, let's figure out a way to make sure to turn these acres into affordable home ownership opportunities in our city. Okay, let's go, Norm. And then we've got a second Slido question we'll get to here. So let's go, Norm, and then we'll go to the Slido question for you.
So two questions. What was the result
Well,
of the
there are two questions. I
ombudsman?
got to write them down. So hold on.
What was the result of the ombudsman's opinion?
That yes, in this particular fact pattern, school districts had to pay impact fees.
Okay.
Owen's got his hand up. Todd's nodding his head. Are you raising your hand to talk about this? You're going into more detail than I can repeat. So Molly, do you mind running?
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
Let's wait for the microphone. I know we can hear you in the room, but they cannot hear you on the internet. And we love the people on the internet too.
You have to make sure that your impact fee studies account for schools and public entities, buildings. You can't just do your impact fee studies and then go and say, oh, you also have to pay impact fees. So we had accounted for schools paying their impact fees in our city, and that's how the ombudsman's office ruled. So we had to get a third party because there was some bias in the ombudsman's office, but that's a whole nother story. So
Perfect. Well, and recognizing the ombudsman's office is advisory, not binding. It was really interesting analysis and important for local governments. So thank you for the nuance there. Owen, Norm, you had a second question.
I just want to make sure that I'm clear. You keep saying the word enabling. We're trying to enable affordable home ownership, right? Not enable developers.
That's actually not how I was using the term enable, but yes, that would be another way to use the term enabled here. So when I'm talking about enabling, rather than getting all legally complicated up here, under state law, if the legislature has not told us no, then U.S. cities can act. You can fill in the space. But once the legislature says no, they've preempted the space. That's a different legal framework than most states in the country. Most states in the country need to ask permission from their legislature in order to act, or they rely on their home rule charter system. We only have one charter city left in the state of Utah. So we're in this unique spot where as long as the legislature hasn't said no, we don't need permission. However, in the space of being able to require certain things in zoning, the legislature has partially said no. And so that's the question is the legislature has said we cannot regulate ownership when it comes to co-owned housing. Well, does that mean that in zoning? So does that mean in zoning, we can't regulate ownership, period? And the answer is, well, it's maybe. So that's why I am using the term intentionally of enabling language to clarify, no, in this situation, you could require ownership for this type of overlay. But we also have to be careful that we don't run afoul of takings clauses by saying you can just put it in your zoning and it applies anywhere every time. That's where an overlay comes in because then it's not a taking of your existing property right. Okay. Slide to question number 2.
All right, so we've mentioned the state housing plan, we mentioned the UEOC 10-year goal. There's a whole bunch of other stakeholders in this space who are trying to figure out where we need to get to on housing and growth and 1,000 other issues. I think one of the main questions that we have or that we receive as staff is what's a good metric to show that local governments are being good stakeholders? And sometimes this comes from groups who are maybe more adversarial, trying to just push back and invent their own metrics. Sometimes this comes from other stakeholders who just say, we believe that cities are doing their part, help us make the case for that. And in the past, we've used some metrics like entitlements, we've used metrics like housing permits. I don't know that we have the perfect system right now that encompasses everybody, right? So high growth cities, for example, they have lots of entitled units. They have a lot of building permits each year. They can show their part on housing that way. If you have some built out cities, that's a much harder case to make. And they might have infill, but it might be just smaller. They might have some plots that they tried to rezone, but development's not interested. So what we want from you is to help us figure out how we can tell your story. How can we work local government into this bigger picture on housing? Is it, well, I won't even say anything, but yeah, we just want to keep it open and we want to just know what are we missing? How can we better tell your story? Is it, is it rezones? Is it, Mayor?
Yeah, so Carson, so we had a meeting of the steering committee for the state housing plan this morning, and there were some of the league had shared some information about what kinds of metrics, I think that may have come from the board about what kind of metrics should be used to measure our progress with respect to both home ownership, first-time home ownership, as well as compliance with our moderate income housing plans. So there were things on there and they were weighted by percentages of entitlements, permits, construction, certificates of occupancy. And there are a whole bunch of other categories of metrics that we could use. And so when we answer this question that's up here right now, a couple things to consider, I think. Number one, the more reporting that we need to do, it's a burden on our planning staffs or otherwise to do that, right? We already have this burden to, comply with the moderate income housing requirements options. However, the balance against that burden is our interest in not being beat up on our local control. And the more data that we can provide, the better defense we can make that either we're doing what we need to do as municipalities or the problem lies somewhere else. And the point that I made, that there was pressure at this meeting today to simplify and cut down on the number of metrics. So like, why do we need to track entitlements and permits and certificates of occupancy? And the reason we need to track more variables like that is we have to know that in order to know where the bottlenecks are. So we've already provided data to the state about the fact that there have been a ton of entitlements in our state, even though we still have a housing shortage. So why is that? Because there is a blockage with respect to infrastructure or a blockage with respect to the development community not starting projects due to interest rates. If we don't track these variables all the way through, we will never know what's causing the problem. And we'll just come up with the same old thing that we've had before where we get blamed for it. Okay. So when we answer this question about what metrics should be incorporated into the housing plan, I encourage you to be expansive and to think about the things that would actually be reflective of trying to solve where are the problems. Because I still think that not all the problems are with municipalities. Okay.
Yep, well said, Mayor. And I want to piggyback on two of those points. First, on planning staff, and I can't tell you the amount of times this summer that I've said, I've just respond with the question, do you want your planners actually doing the work and reviewing permits, or do you want your planners providing metrics to the state? And I think there's a balance to be had there. And I'm definitely concerned about a lot of the requirements that we've seen suggested in various venues and what they actually mean for city work capacity. The second piece I want to add on, and you hinted this, Mayor, too, is are we actually measuring what we can control for, or are we measuring on outcomes that are not immediately in our control, right? So building permits, you can zone all you want, but in a market like this where interest rates are still high and everybody's kind of afraid to pull permits, should cities be held accountable for that piece, or should we be held accountable for what we actually can control? And is there a way to actually quantify what we can control? And again, some of that rests on things like entitlements, but you're right, with infrastructure, how do you balance that? Is it communities investing money to try to solve the problem? Is it communities who just don't have the means, period? Is it just that there's no water in place, right? We have all these bottlenecks, and yeah, we're just trying to cast a broad net here to figure out what we can actually bring back to the state and say, here's the pieces that we can control. Stop trying to measure everything under the sun. So yeah, we'll continue to work with different groups to try to figure out, narrow down this list once we have a wide net.
Perfect. Councilor Higginson.
Where's the state's effort to gather data on the mandates that they've sent to us? Like Representative Ward's ADU bill. What's the state doing to gather data on how effective or ineffective that was, or any of their other overreaches?
Great question. I don't know that there's much of an effort to capture that. We've talked a lot with other state leagues about trying to figure out how to quantify some of these things, and it's difficult. Part of the push to have the number of internal ADU permits authorized in your moderate income housing plans, that data point is supposed to be able to try to help inform that. But we've also heard from many of you that somebody with an internal ADU, maybe they had it before, maybe not, but we don't really have a lot of teeth or enforcement resources to go around and just to enforce that. So that also invites the question of how much of this is just an academic exercise to figure out what's working and what's not, how much of it is actually useful, and how should we prioritize that balance? And as much as I'd love to collect data on everything and anything and everything, that's not really a good use of everybody's time. So yeah, that's an excellent point too.
Perfect. I am now going to narrow the focus to the land use task force. We showed you the slides from the CHA that had a bunch of policy items and technical items. And this is the list from that CHA list that is in that land use task force space. Now, we've highlighted these two because these are the two we're going to reference today, bonding and design standards. But this gives you a sense of the land use task force items that are under the CHA umbrella. This does not include WILF, like the annexation, because that's separate from the CHA, but within the land use task force umbrella. Okay, we've asked you quite a few questions related to bonding. And right now, the different policy questions that we're still trying to work through revolve around the withholding of the C of O, phase release by category, and the timing thereof, and then the timing of inspection of warranty work, repair correction, extraordinary circumstances, et cetera. Todd, here's what I'm going to propose, just in light of the time and knowing that this gets pretty technical. We got draft language from the PRC that we were able to really look at in earnest about, I guess, 2 hours ago now. For some communities, particularly rapid growth communities, you are on the front lines of what the impact to potential state law changes around bonding would be. So our ask, Todd, if it's all right with you, is if just after LPC, we just maybe huddle in the back corner for 15, 20 minutes, and we can just talk through a couple of these questions with those of you who are interested. So I know people online, I'm sorry, we won't be able to accommodate that. But those of you who are here, if you can stay for a few extra minutes, particularly rapid growth communities who are in the weeds on bonding issues, to just talk through a couple of these questions and give us some feedback. Todd, does that work for you? Okay. On design standards, as you recall, several years ago, the legislature prohibited cities from being able to require certain design standards in zoning, though we can still require them in development agreements. So we've heard from some communities who would like to restore certain design standards into zoning. These are four of those potential examples. What we're trying to figure out is just the overall level of priority for communities on this front. So here's another Slido question here. Within your city, what level of priority is it to be able to regulate color, exterior facade, and variety of form and scale within zoning instead of the development agreement? So again, status quo is you could, through a development agreement, require certain colors or require a certain variety of form and scale, or even get to the missing middle mansion house type concept where it's 3 units in one, but it looks like a house from the sidewalk. That's hard to do under basic zoning right now because of that prohibition, but you can do it in a development agreement. So how big of a priority is it for your community to try to get some of that flexibility back into your zoning rather than doing it through development agreement? Because that'll help us as we're negotiating all these different pieces to know, yes, this is a really big deal to get it back into zoning, or actually we're okay being able to do this through development agreement rather than in zoning. Okay. So we're up to 65. I'll leave that open for a few more seconds. Dwayne, Angela's on her way with the mic. And Councilmember Tully and Margaret, you can tell Mark Harrington, thank you, because he's the one who an hour ago said, I'm not prepared to answer this question. You should take it to LPC. And I said, good point. LPC starts in 2 minutes. But, yeah.
So Cameron, my answer to this is going to depend a lot about what kind of preemption happens. So if the state preempts things and people have rights to do things that they wouldn't otherwise have rights to do that I would do right now through a development agreement, then this would matter a lot.
Right.
If there's not preemption, then it's not as big of a priority.
If I could figure out how to write that as a Slido question, I would, because that's kind of the phase we're getting into right now, is you have all these different moving parts. And so we're trying to figure out, how big of a priority are these different pieces? So if the situation arose like you just described, or said, well, I'm going to use an outlandish example to illustrate it, but the legislature said tomorrow, we are getting rid of zoning, but we'll allow you to require color. Right? Doesn't really work. But did you say depend on specifics? I heard that from the other side of the room. But if it's something that's a little more nuanced of like, okay, maybe, we have to swallow X, and we say, you know what, that actually makes sense. We could swallow X, but in exchange, we need this sort of flexibility because this would actually help our residents embrace this type of development better. Okay, now we're getting somewhere that's a good policy. I saw a hand. Yep, Dave.
I think also for us, it depends on area. Our original town site, which is like 48 blocks, a lot of those are half blocks. They platted it in the 1800s, and we still have vacant lots, and we have housing styles in every decade going back to 1850.
That's true.
And so we look at how is this different than a suburban development that builds out in 3 years, and all those styles are 1980 styles.
Right.
And so we identified porch and garage and those type of things, and there's a certain height element too. And we enacted this back in 2002, 2003, and it's been very successful. And it's a model from a neighborhood conservation district from North Carolina, and it's not an historic preservation thing, and so it's worked well. And we don't care if it looks like a 2020 home next to a 1940s home. They got to have some elements that are in common. And so it's a different beast. And so it was difficult for us to answer So Amy picked low priority, I picked medium priority. We do not regulate color or anything like that.
Right. Well, you're not the only city to have LPC reps vote differently. That happens all the time. That'll peek behind the curtain there. But yes, we recognize it's going to vary depending where you are in the city. And again, we're just trying to get a quick snapshot to help as things are going. But thank you for articulating those key points. Okay. Separate from the CHA, you also have Representative Ward, who presented to political subcommittee, and then Representative Ballard, who's working on a bill. Both of them represent South Davis County. Representative Ward's bill would be ADUs by right in all residential areas, small lots by right in all residential areas, and then housing and commercial areas by right as well. I had a very good conversation with him a few weeks ago, or I guess it was just last week, no, 2 weeks ago now. And he basically acknowledged, like, I know that the league's not going to like my initial concepts here, but here's what I'm trying to do. I'm happy to come meet with the league. We're going to set up a meeting either with the league board or maybe with our LPC housing subgroup to chat with him in more detail. There may not be any path to consensus there, but just wanted to let you know that there was his original version, which we presented to you last month, and he's already trying to tweak that based on what he's heard from cities and others. Meanwhile, Representative Ballard has a concept that would change the point of vesting and basically say that if an applicant buys a piece of property, they would be vested as of the time of purchase, even if they haven't started doing anything to improve the property or start the land use process, and they would be vested for 2 years. We think we know where everybody's at on this one, but we're going to do a starter question anyway, just to help as we follow back up with her. We're not doing slide on Representative Ward because we've heard feedback and we know he's changing the bill. But just know we are going to set up an LPC housing subgroup meeting. Those of you who've been on that subgroup, because that meeting's been really helpful all interim. We're going to set one of those up after Thanksgiving to go into a little more detail on some of these. So this is the Representative Ballard proposal, vesting land use applications at the point of purchase for a period of 2 years. Tell me how you really feel, Frank.
Cam,
Oh.
just to specify, the
Oh.
ADUs are external.
Yes. Thank you, Cassidy. Yeah, but it would be expanding to all types of ADUs. So again, this would be the vesting for 2 years. And then this is our last land use one. So before we leave the land use CHA space to get to revenue, are there any other questions for Carson and me on housing land use stuff while we leave this open for a few more seconds? Any other questions online or in person? Go ahead, Angela.
I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but I'm curious, are these bills that you guys just put up here part of the 5 bills that Senator Fillmore?
No.
These are in addition to
Yes.
those 5 bills that Senator Fillmore mentioned in
Yes.
USC?
Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Like I said, we showed that graphic at the beginning of like all those different moving pieces. This is that 5th moving piece of legislators running bills. Now, to the credit of both of these legislators, both Representative Ward and Representative Ballard, they've reached out to us they wanted to get feedback. Representative Ballard and Representative Ward both presented to the land use task force to get feedback, but they are separate from the CHA process. Okay, I'm over 90. Any final questions, Cassidy, before we move to revenue? Okay, then I think we're good there. Okay, let's talk revenue. Just make sure I tip on my notes here. Okay, perfect. So yeah, once LPC finishes, we'll just meet in the back corner on the bonding piece. So last call there. For those online, you could still drive here if you want to join that for the quick snapshot on a couple of those issues. Revenue and taxes, property sales tax, tourism, and then I'll also reference transportation utility fees here. On the property tax side, there's already a double-digit number of bill files open related to property tax. As has been referenced, the National League of Cities was had their annual convention last week. Kudos to Bountiful City, by the way. They were recognized on stage for 50 years of NLC membership, and you got a certificate for it, right, Gary? Yeah. Right. But Councilmember Higginson accepted that on behalf of Bountiful City. And then next year, that conference will be here in Salt Lake. And kudos to Councilmember Petro for helping everyone get excited about the conference in Salt Lake next year. And so a lot more details about that to come. But one of the interesting policy takeaways is Mark Christensen, Justin, and I attended the meeting of the Western Municipal Association. And Mark, did it make you feel better or worse about our situation in Utah as you heard about all the other Western states and the challenges around land use and revenue?
I am very sorry to say that we have the least crazy crazy legislators of anyone in the room. So if that helps us feel better about our position, yay, we win.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I was hoping that's what you would say. I didn't plant that question. I was a little nervous when I asked you to speak, but that worked. Well, I mentioned there are a double-digit number of property tax bills, and we spent a lot of time last week at the NLC conference hearing from other state leagues about the challenges that they're facing around property tax caps. Because while we have truth in taxation, it's not a cap. It's a political challenge, but you can raise property tax, and many of you have the scars to prove it. So interestingly, though, there are quite a few legislators that are looking at maybe bringing in some of those cap concepts to Utah. So they've reached out, several legislators have reached out in the last few weeks asking where would the league be on these types of concepts. And so nothing has been drafted yet, but we wanted to just take a quick pulse of this group so that we have a sense of where you're at. And I'm going to walk through these. You can select all that apply. So status quo at the bottom is the current truth and taxation process. So yes, you have to go through public noticing. You have to have public hearings. It's tough to have those conversations with the public, but if ultimately Cameron City wants to raise property tax by 50%, Cameron City can raise property tax by 50%. You just have to have those tough conversations with the public. So that's at the bottom. Let me go back up to the top. So one, small annual automatic adjustment. So basically you'd have your certified tax rate plus X percent. Just know it would be small. What legislators have said to us is it would be a small automatic adjustment, but then that would be it. So basically truth and taxation is history. You would just have an annual adjustment of a certain amount. So that's option one. Option two, and I also should note, Roger wasn't able to be here in person today, so I'm doing my best Roger analysis here. I'm waiting for my phone to blow up with Roger sending me some corrections. So just, Roger, I can hear your voice in my head. Second, small automatic adjustment, but then still have truth and taxation process for a larger amount up to a cap. Now, what that cap would be, who knows? And I can already hear the question from you of like, well, if the cap's 50%, that sounds great. But if the cap is 4%, less great. But we're just trying to get an idea of the concept. And then the third one, still status quo. So no automatic adjustment on top of the certified tax rate, but there would be some sort of cap. So no automatic adjustment, but then you could still go through truth and taxation, but you couldn't do 50%. You could only go up to whatever that cap is. Councilmember Petro.
I'm not understanding what problem we're trying to solve. I mean, I know we're all lush with funds and just paving our streets here, but will they also be capping how much territory they can preempt from us and how much increment they can take from us and how many residents I'm going to have to serve? They just gave me multiple thousands of constituents coming with literally no revenue outside of what I can squeak out in an interlocal agreement.
Yep, excellent points. And I got distracted when I was going down my path about the other state leagues, and I didn't answer your first question at the beginning. And I mentioned there were double-digit number of bills over on property tax, and there are a lot of legislators who feel like local governments have gone too far in raising property taxes the last few years. Now, and my response back to them has been, an average city is 12% of your property tax. And the bang that you get for your buck on property tax is excellent. And I've attended truth and taxation hearings. And while, yes, they are tough, there often also are people who get up and say, thank you for the police service. Thank you for the roads. We don't like this, but we can live with it. So local governments at the capital mean school districts, counties, cities, special service districts. But these are some of the ideas that have come up. And so that's why we wanted to just get a first blush from the group on these ideas. So I thought I saw a hand over here. hands down. Let's go Gary, and then if a hand came up, you're okay, Councilmember? Okay, Gary.
Cameron, how much of this, two-part question, how much of this is being as a reflection of the national sentiment from other legislatures where the property tax burden is frankly much, much higher than in Utah? And related to that, does our legislature understand, or can we help them understand what the property tax burden is in Utah compared to most other places in the country?
Yep.
And second, have they had conversations? Do they understand the challenge this would create for our ability to bond? That right now, one of the reasons we are able to bond is because of our ability essentially to increase property tax to support the bond, however high we need to. This will have a dramatic impact on all of our bond ratings as a state.
Yeah, I was writing down your questions, make sure I got them. So the first one, yes, I think there's a component of this is the national data about property tax burden. I also think we have seen particularly school districts the last few years do some really sizable property tax increases. And so there is a local component to it. And that's why I said local governments in air quotes, because I think they all get lumped together. And I was at a truth and taxation hearing a couple of years ago. In fact, it was Councilmember McGuire's truth and taxation hearing, where the first 5 people all got up and said, I'm really mad about the school district property tax increase. And the mayor said, I'm sorry to hear that. Their hearing was last week. Ours is today, and this is what you're getting for it. And all 5 of them, as I recall, Councilmember, all of them said, well, I don't like increases, but I appreciate what you're trying to do with the police. Right. So yes, I think there's that national piece, but with a local component that's more school district driven, and a couple of counties this year have generated some headlines there too. The second piece about challenge on bonding, like part of the reason we're bringing this up is as you're setting meetings with legislators between now and the session, now that the election's over, is we collectively need to make sure legislators understand actually how we're funded and what the impacts of these types of ideas are. Because the meeting I mentioned that Mark and I sat in, you had Nevada and California and Arizona, well, not Arizona, because Arizona doesn't have a uniform property tax. Some cities do it, some cities don't. But these states were all saying, because we're capped here, like we just can't keep up with infrastructure whatsoever. And they were all lamenting that. And we could say, well, yeah, actually, we can raise property tax. We were one of the few in the room who could actually say, yeah, we can raise property tax. So helping legislators understand the consequences on bonding and the consequences if you go too far the other direction.
One question, one comment. Questioner, is the small automatic adjustment and the cap tied together? Do they come all as a package deal, or is there discussion about having those separated in any?
To be determined. Like right now, it's all been in the concept form. We had people reaching out to us in September, October, throwing these ideas out, but everything was on hold until the election. The day after the election, I had a legislator call and say, well, I've got this bill file open. I've had it on hold, but I really want some feedback on it. It's maybe this, maybe this, maybe this.
And the comment is, it's not one of the options, but having the automatic adjustment up to a certain percentage that would not require the truth in taxation process, but anything above that still have the truth in taxation process without a cap.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Dave. I thought I saw another hand. Mayor Burton.
I'm just thinking if there's a cap, a lot of cities have different rates right now. I could see everyone raising that. Their goal is to get to that cap, to get where they can while they still can, and may end up doing the opposite of what these state legislators are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, excellent point, Mayor. Excellent point, Mayor. And I did just get my text from Roger, but so far I've been accurate with what I've been saying. So that's good. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next revenue question. We mentioned this at last LPC, and we put together a small work group of certain cities. Again, extending the invitation. If any of your cities want to be involved in conversations around state tourism taxes, we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with about a dozen communities. And these were some of the ideas that came out of that conversation. So we wanted to get kind of broader feedback on these concepts because we've got a meeting coming up soon with some legislators to talk about it. So this question is focused on the county imposed TRT. So with the exception of the fourth option here, county imposed TRT requiring an advisory group of municipal government. So in other words, right now, the tourism money that the counties impose, you have a tourism advisory board in every county that determines how that money is spent. So should municipal governments have a seat at that table? So that's option one. Option two, actually the state requiring counties to share that county revenue with municipal governments. This is a tricky space here, like the idea of the state, us supporting the state, telling one local government how to spend their money. We often fight against them telling us how to spend our money. But the concept here is counties get a lot of money from tourism, but a lot of the impacts from tourism fall on the cities to mitigate. So that's the problem they're trying to solve with point number two. Point number three is a different way to address that, but say the counties have to spend the revenue proportionally and locally. So I have Santa Clara sitting here in the second row, so I'll use Washington County as an example. Washington County generates a significant amount of tourism money, but the vast majority of that money is generated within certain cities. So should there be a requirement to say that a percentage of that money has to be spent in the jurisdiction where it's collected, or spent proportionally where it's collected, something therein. And then this fourth one is a little separate from county TRT, but it's creating this new state level tourism tax. So there's currently a state TRT, expanding that and then sharing it with locals. And then last, this is not an issue in my county. And this is actually helpful for us to know too. If it's not an issue in your county, please say so, because our work group is filled with cities for whom this is a very, 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 very big issue. So we just want to get a sense within the membership, like, yep, it's a really big issue in these areas, but it's not a big issue over here. And then we can act accordingly. Okay, I'll leave this one open for a second. We're cruising here. I've got one more revenue related starter question. Okay. This gets to the fifth. This was modified now 2 sessions ago. Prior to the modification, it would have sunsetted in I gotta make sure I got my dates right. It would have sunsetted summer of 2023. It's a 0.20 county imposed tax, and under the old version of the law, 100% had to be used on transit. We modified it in that 2023 session. I say we, royal we here, because lots of action alerts and legislators really delivered for us. And we changed that 0.20 to where 25% of the money goes to cities once the county imposes it. Up to this point, 2 counties have imposed the fifth. Summit County imposed it under the old rules. Utah County has now imposed it under the new rules. So one of the challenges that we face representing the league at the Capitol is we're talking about infrastructure money. The legislature gave us a really good tool for infrastructure money, and it's sitting on the shelf right now. So what we're trying to get a sense from you is your county considering it? We just want to get a quick snapshot. Is your county considering it next year? Are they considering it, but without a date? They're not considering it at all. You're not sure. Or in the case of Utah and Summit counties, it's already been imposed. So hopefully this is a quick one. We'll leave this open for a few more seconds. As I leave this open, let me give you a quick update on the transportation utility fee. Representative Karen Peterson's bill last year, House Bill 367, passed the House, failed in the Senate. We are anticipating someone to bring a version of that bill back, and we anticipate that version of the bill will not look like House Bill 367 did last year. Last year, one of the key principles was we had agreed to support a bill that made it harder but not impossible to do transportation utility fees. It also had some limits around public safety fees and a prohibition on any sort of new broadband fees. There's been a lot of chatter at the Capitol around broadband related fees and public safety related fees. And then there's been discussion at the Capitol around whether or not everyone should have to pay a transportation utility fee, or if just certain entities pay and other entities don't pay. So stay tuned on that. That's just the quick update. We'll be meeting with the House and Senate leadership with the league officers next month, and this will be one of the items we'll be discussing with them. Okay. Before we pivot to the other issues and I take a break, are there any other questions in the revenue space? that anybody wants to bring up before the group? Okay, in that case, I'm going to turn it over to Carson for the fentanyl task force, which was not on the agenda, but is a big deal. So I'll let you do that and we'll knock through the other items.
Awesome. So among the fun activities at the Capitol last week, we had the first meeting of the governor's new fentanyl task force. And I just want to give a very quick update on this. The Department of Public Safety has pulled together stakeholders from a bunch of different law enforcement agencies, including the Chiefs of Police Association, federal agencies, Department of Justice, pretty much everybody under the sun in law enforcement space, and local government representatives, including ULCT and UAC, were also invited to participate. And sort of the goal of this task force is an all hands on deck approach to trying to reduce fentanyl use in the state and particularly mitigate harmful outcomes. And I just wanted to include this one chart because I thought this was pretty staggering. And much of that meeting was just a briefing on what both the Department of Health and various law enforcement agencies are seeing. And I was, again, pretty stunned that fentanyl pills, and this is just seizures, so not necessarily the total realm of how much fentanyl is coming through our state, but that grew from 2,636 pills to 429,557 pills. And that number just blew me away. The other piece that I thought was worth mentioning is that whereas a few years ago, much of the seizures were just people who are passing fentanyl through the state, so maybe not necessarily stopping in the state, but they're starting to see more fentanyl actually on the streets and more distribution directly to Utah. So I just bring this up because I think there'll be a lot more effort here. Again, this is primarily a law enforcement effort, but local governments are concerned about fentanyl use and have some stake in this. So I don't have anything other than just wanted to let you know that this effort's underway. There's a press conference, and so you can learn more there. And we're happy to be a continued resource there. All right, quiet zones, trains, more fun than fentanyl. So those of you who have rail tracks in your city and are no longer quiet zones are well aware of this. So I don't need to go into a lot of depth. But I just want to provide this quick update. We have 2 quiet zone areas in Utah, one being from Woods Cross to Salt Lake and the other being from Salt Lake to Provo. And there was a new federal rule passed last year. There's been additional inspections, and I know that there's been some frustration with federal agencies trying to work through the process, but most of the safety issues that would allow quiet zones to be restored are underway. But it requires every single safety issue has to be addressed in every single city before the whole quiet zone can be reinstated. So I know there's work happening, but we have heard that there's a possibility of legislation to try to require it would be UTA to basically oversee this and make sure that local governments are complying with federal rules. And UTA has indicated that they have no interest in doing this. And I think we have some concerns about UTA having that kind of oversight authority over cities. So yeah, just to put this on your radar, I don't know the legislation will actually manifest, but we've heard rumblings about it. And then I'll turn it back to Cam over for libraries. Yeah. I don't know. I know that there's only a handful left and all the cities are working diligently to try to address them. I know there's some private property issues and some just complicated things with 2 spots left. So yeah, I live near train tracks, so I would be thrilled to not be awoken by train horns at 5 a.m. anymore. But I know that there's still some work to be done, and there's different agencies that have to be coordinated. So it's a complicated effort, but I do know that all the cities are working very hard to address those last couple of things. So hopefully pretty darn soon.
Okay, this one will be quick. How many of your cities in the room provide your own library service? So not the county service, but provide your own. Okay, so maybe a third of the room. And actually, those are all cities that I had pointed out in my initial list. So that's awesome. Okay. If your city provides library services, here's the policy question. state law says library board appoints the director, but a state law also says only one council member can be on the board. So, and the mayor can't be on that board either. And that provision hasn't changed since 1992. So we had a city, it was Logan City, reached out to us a couple of weeks ago because they're going through this transition. And so we think it's worth having a policy discussion of whether the mayor and city council should have more influence in that process. And we said, okay, before you go forward with changing this, change the statute, let's pull together interested cities and have this discussion. They have a bill sponsor who's interested in looking at it. So if your city's interested in having this discussion, we want to organize a call fairly soon. Just shoot me a quick email and we can hop on a call and talk through these points. Okay. Easy peasy. With that, Justin, I'll turn it back to you. Okay.
Oh, agritourism proposal. That one's Carson. I just needed to see how many times I could get up these stairs without tripping in my size too big shoes. So agritourism. So again, this is another proposal that we've just heard. I don't have a bill sponsor for you. I don't know a lot of details, but we've heard some frustration that, you know, there's a lot more agritourism related activities. You know, whether it's like just fun little temporary events, whether it's seasonal things like corn mazes. And some of those are not allowed within local ordinances. I've expressed it to some of the interested parties that this is likely more of a county issue, but they wanted our feedback as well. So basically what the proposal would do is require municipalities and counties to go through their agricultural zones and just list certain uses as being allowed. The proposal says that, you know, we have these certain things that we think are seasonal or have very limited impact that we think should be allowed, period. And there's a whole laundry list of other things that they just would like local governments to consider. I don't have a lot more detail than that, so I don't want to spend a lot of time there. But if you have agricultural areas in your community that are doing a lot of agritourism or that are interested, or you just have general feedback on this, please send it my way and I'll loop you into additional conversations. And then another topic that I've heard about but don't have a lot of details on is similarly, there's some cities have specific processes in their ordinances for listing additional uses that haven't been considered by the legislative body before. So the thought would be if you have a new like innovative type of business that, or maybe like a disruptive type of business that isn't necessarily addressed either, well, isn't necessarily allowed or prohibited by your code, just creating an expedited process for those kind of uses to be considered or brought to your council, just to give those people more certainty. So once again, I don't have a lot of depth here. I don't have any language, but if you'd like to be looped into this conversation, please shoot me an email. Okay, now back to Justin. All right, last one here. Just want to make you aware of this one. There was an article in Des News yesterday, you may have seen that, but there was going to be a proposal out there in the legislative session to create an independent state elections office. So instead of it, if you don't know, the elections office is currently housed in the Lieutenant Governor's office. Lieutenant Governor is the chief election officer for the state. There is going to be a proposal this year to create an independent state elections office. Don't know how much political will there is behind that. Don't know where that's going to go. I just want to make you aware that that's out there. And similarly, there may be a proposal to limit who gets vote by mail ballots. So don't have anything specific on this one yet. Just want to make sure that you are aware of it. The second one, proposal to limit vote by mail ballots, may be something we care more about than the first one from a league perspective. But just so you know, there are going to be some fairly substantial, I think, discussions around elections. Mark has a hand up. Angela.
So I'm asking for a friend in Utah County, but is there any way that we can have them gut counties and make them independent at the same time? I mean, let's just, if we're going to fix it, let's fix it all the way down. Just a suggestion.
I will put that in the suggestion box. I could say I haven't heard anything about discussions around, I should say, I haven't heard anything this year about discussions around counties, focusing on the state at this point, but here goes. So finally, upcoming events. So we have some webinars that are coming up. Powers and duties. There's a strong mayor's webinar tomorrow from 12 to 1. A tax increment financing and redevelopment areas on December 3rd from 12 to 1. Powers and duties council manager form of government December 17th from 12 to 1. If you want to RSVP for any of those events, go to ulct.org/events. Now, legislative session coming up here in, I don't know, 10 weeks. But we are not having an LPC in December. So for all of you who are looking really forward to LPC in December, sorry to disappoint you, we're not going to have one. But because the legislative session is starting a week later this year, the way the calendar is than did the last couple of years, we will have an LPC in January. So on January 13th, Monday the 13th, we will be back here for an LPC. We'll be able to tell you a lot more about specific bills. Today, I know there's been a lot of concepts. We should start seeing a lot more specific bills that we can talk about on the 13th. So LPC on the 13th, the following week, the legislative session starts. That first Wednesday of the legislative session will be our local officials day. We had that. So here you see all these up here. So today, last interim this week, we will have our board meeting. So we do have a time to check in on the 9th, but then LPC on the 13th, beginning the session 21st of January, local officials day on the 22nd. And then for all of you who are maybe new or don't know, we do LPC every Monday, except for President's Day during the legislative session. So that'll be in the room it's been in the last few years, 210 in the Senate. So in 10 weeks, 10 and a half weeks, we'll have LPC during the session, but plenty of chance to check in. We'll have those work group meetings, many of those smaller work group meetings during December. So stay in touch with us. And with that, Councilmember Bradshaw, I think I heard a final motion. Oh, there's a second. And I heard Kate say all in favor. Okay, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.